The EU talks of restarting the Middle East peace process, while Israel's Prime Minister slams the continent for hypocrisy. As European and US policies towards the Middle East diverge, what options does Brussels really have? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, there have been widespread protests and condemnation since the US announced its recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. As activists around the world take to the streets in anger, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is on his own tour to change minds. He's hoping to convince European leaders to follow the lead of US President Donald Trump. Netanyahu met EU foreign ministers in Brussels on Monday. The Israeli leader was also expected to open the issue of the Iran nuclear deal. Most EU members have expressed alarm over Donald Trump's decision on Jerusalem. EU leaders say they want Netanyahu to resume meaningful negotiations with Palestinians.
We believe that the only realistic solution to the conflict between Israel and Palestine is based on two states, with Jerusalem as the capital of both the State of Israel and the State of Palestine along the 67 line. This is our consolidated position, and we will continue to respect the international consensus on Jerusalem until the final status of the Holy City is resolved to direct negotiations between the parties, and we hope that the parties can engage in meaningful direct negotiations with the support of the international community. This is why the European Union will increase its work together with our international friends and partners, but also with friends and partners in the region, starting from Egypt and Jordan, and obviously with the parties, with Israel and Palestine, to start to relaunch the peace process, even if it seems difficult times.
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister has been very critical of the EU response.
I ascribe great importance to Europe. While I respect Europe, I am not prepared to accept a double standard from it. I hear voices from there condemning President Trump's historic statement, but I have not heard condemnations of the rockets fired at Israel or the terrible incitement against it. I am not prepared to accept this hypocrisy, and as usual, at this important forum, I will present Israel's truth without fear and with head held high.
Well, Jerusalem's status isn't the only policy the US and EU disagree on. For example, the US president has condemned the Iran nuclear deal as a very bad agreement. The European countries who are part of it, though, stand by it. Then there's the GCC crisis. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE and Egypt have imposed a blockade on Qatar. EU countries issued measured statements calling for talks, while Trump's immediate response was to condemn Qatar, remarks his own State Department later contradicted. And the US and EU, if we want to take it international, they've got different policies when it comes to the environment. The Trump administration's pulled out of the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change. Let's bring our guest now into the show. We have here in Doha Ali Fathollah-Nejad, visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. In Jerusalem, Robbie Sable, a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And on Skype from Cairo, James Moran, an associate senior research fellow at the Center for European Policy. James served as a principal advisor on the Middle East and North Africa at the EU's External Action Service in Brussels. Welcome to you all. If I could start with James in Cairo. So the EU Foreign Policy Chief, James, has been speaking about what she calls increasing the EU's work to relaunch the Middle East peace process. Can the EU relaunch what almost all analysts now call a dead peace process?
Well, I don't think that it's possible for any one player in this great debate to do it alone. It will be very, very important to look for partnerships and try to find a way forward together. And I think that's now
what sort of way forward together, and what sort of partnerships can the EU perhaps look for now that haven't already been explored in the past?
Well, I think the first thing is that you've heard from Federica Mogherini there very clearly that as far as the EU as a whole is concerned, nothing has changed. When it comes to Jerusalem, we stay with the 1993 consensus so far as its status is concerned, that it should be the subject at the very final stages of negotiations, not up front. In fact, the announcement the other day, I think as we all know, has really not helped that at all in terms of getting the parties back to the table. So the EU, I think, will be looking for others like-minded to find a way forward. I'm not quite sure that we can say what that way will be, because right now we're operating in something of a vacuum, but we need to seek out like-minded partners. And we need to keep prevailing on the United States, at least to take another look at this, because you need the US as part and parcel of that process. How to get them back in again?
Another very difficult question, but we'll come back and I'll try and get you to perhaps look into your crystal ball on that one in a bit, James. But let me take the question to Robbie. And does Israel want to see the European Union play a bigger role to try and, in its version of it or its vision, relaunch the Middle East peace process?
I think the role that the EU can take and Europe can take is simply to encourage the Palestinians to negotiate and to convince them there's no other ways. Often the Palestinians seem to feel that some other outside body will produce the goods. It won't. They have to sit down, make difficult compromises. Israel will also have to make compromises, difficult compromises, but that is the only route. And what we see very often
Robbie, that doesn't seem to be the direction that European leaders are taking, though, when they talk about activating the European role. I mean, the French president said on Sunday, quote, "It seems to me that freezing settlement building and confidence measures with regard to the Palestinian Authority are important acts to start with." It seems that at least some European leaders think that the role of the EU here is not to slap the wrists of the Palestinians, but to ask the Israelis to stop things like settlements.
Well, I would say I don't think their role is to slap the wrist of the Israelis either. Their role is to encourage the Palestinians, sit down with the Israelis. I think Israel has proved that when we sit down and negotiate, we've done it with Egypt, we've done it with Jordan, we began doing it with the Palestinians, we can reach an agreement, but there is no other way. And again, the Palestinians hope that somehow perhaps the UN, or in this case the EU, will somehow do the job for them. They won't. They've got to sit down with us, negotiate and make difficult compromise decisions.
All right, let's bring Ali in for your perspective on this one. With the US support for Israel, it appears to be becoming more unconditional. We've already seen the recognition of Jerusalem without requesting now anything in return. Can the Europeans or anyone else offer any other sort of strong incentives for Israel to then make peace if they're getting more and more unconditional support from the US?
Well, I mean, first of all, Trump's announcement was not a surprise as it was portrayed in much of the media, because President Trump has merely officialized the US position that was quite biased in the first place towards Israel, in favor of Israel. So this is the first point. The second point, if you would, you were watching the European leaders' reactions to the Trump announcement, you would have guessed that the European countries are the torchbearers of the Palestinian cause, which is also not true. So Europe has also been quite biased. In a peace process, there was more a chimera than a reality. So what we basically need is a lot more political pressure, especially on both sides, of course, but especially on one side, which is the Netanyahu government, that has not been seen as someone that is really interested in having a resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians.
But when it comes to that point, Ali, I mean, can they really, is it realistic to expect from the Europeans that they're going to be able to bring that pressure you're talking about if the US is going in a different direction when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians?
I mean, on one side, Mogherini said that they are going to try to, to find some international coalition that is able to do that. On the other hand, if you have watched the press conference yesterday between Netanyahu and French President Emmanuel Macron, there was no willingness also from the French side to take the initiative. So for now, we have a lot of rhetoric on both sides, but there is no real action backing any kind of, resolution of the conflict. Because, I mean, for the Europeans, I mean, they're interested, they've been probably, interested in condemning the Trump announcement because also of not endangering their position in the Arab world, where they have big business interests as well.
Do you agree with that, James? And perhaps the Europeans don't have so much in their arsenal as they think they might?
Well, I don't think we've got any illusions about that. I mean, we've got a long history as EU in dealing with the conflict and the peace process when it was actually a live issue. So I think we know the reality, and I think we know the limits of our own influence.
So is the real goal for the Europeans, perhaps, as you were indicating earlier, to try and bring the Trump administration around on their position on Jerusalem, on their position on how to restart the peace process, perhaps even on the issue of settlement freezing and other actions which are in contravention, Israeli actions in contravention of international law?
Well, I fully agree with you on the issue of settlements. You're absolutely right to bring that up. But yes, I mean, we have to keep working as best we can with the American administration. But let me just add, it's not just about Americans and Europeans and others outside of the region. Apart from the parties themselves, you have people within the region, countries within the region, which also have an important role to play. Egypt being obviously one of them. It's been playing an important role recently on Palestinian reconciliation. It continues to do the best it can to bring the factions together. And the position of Egypt, and indeed others here in the Arab world, does matter. I know there is sometimes a feeling that this is something, when it comes to the international perspective, that is somewhere else. But at least as important are the positions of these countries. And in particular, as I say, this one, but not just Egypt. Jordan, of course, very important in this as well, and Saudi Arabia. And the reactions that we've seen to this announcement tell us that there is great concern again here in the region about where this conflict is now heading. And there's a lot of worry about it. People have a strong common interest to do everything they can to work together. So when I talk about the European Union seeking out partners, we're not just talking about the Americans or the Russians or whoever. We also have to pay great attention to what is happening here in the region.
Let's shift gears a little bit, because another Middle East issue, of course, which the EU and the US seem to have a different position on, or at least a position that's diverging right now, is what to do about the Iran nuclear deal. The US president made no secret of his desire to scrap that and cancel that. I'm wondering, Robbie Sable in Jerusalem, Netanyahu today was expected, of course, to lobby EU foreign ministers on the Iran nuclear deal. What does he want from them? We
don't think the Iranian deal was a good deal, because at the end of the period, Iran will be free to make nuclear bombs. But it is a deal. I mean, we're not suggesting that it be opened up. However, what is happening is the world is ignoring the Iranian violations, and this is worrying. For instance, they're not allowing visits to what they call military sites, and they decide what is a military site.
But probably the IAEA has certified Iranian compliance every time. Are you saying the IAEA doesn't know what it's doing?
What I'm saying is they haven't visited military sites, because it was a bad agreement.
But again, if they say that the Iranians are living up to their end of the deal,
because their interpretation is that they are allowed to prevent visits to military sites.
Well, is their interpretation wrong, though? I mean, to be devil's advocate, are they wrong and you're right? And is that what you're telling viewers? The IAEA has interpreted the agreement.
What I'm saying is there's two major loopholes. The first is what the Iranian considers to be military sites are banned. Second is they promise to allow unexpected visits. It's called the additional protocol. And they're not allowing it. They're not implementing it. So what I would suggest we do now is insist that the agreement be implemented. I think a better agreement could have been reached and should have been reached. But this is what we have now. But the very least, the very minimum is they should implement it. Can I go back to a previous issue you raised?
But before you do that, if I may, I'll come back to you in a second. But you've made some points there, which I'm curious to get Jane's reaction to. And I know, Ali, you're shaking your head here in disagreement in the studio, so I'll come to you as well before we go back to Robbie. I'm glad that we're all getting excited about this one. But if I could start with James for some reaction to that. How receptive an audience are the European Union, the 28 European Union foreign ministers, to that sort of message, which Robbie was explaining might be the message coming from Netanyahu?
I think the 28 and the European institutions are rock solid on where we are with the joint plan of action, the Iranian nuclear deal. According to the terms of reference of that deal, compliance has been acceptable up to now. The IAEA is the central and the key organization that we're depending on for that. They have, I think, 8 times now come back and told us that the Iranians are on track. And that, for us, is acceptable.
I think what Robbie is suggesting, though, is that they're deliberately overlooking parts of the agreement that, in Robbie's interpretation, the Iranians should be living up to, and they're not. What do you make of that?
I'm not sure that's entirely correct. I think that it's also the fact that should there be any great deviation, we would be aware of it, and we would be very, very concerned. We're all concerned about non-proliferation of any kind, and we know very well, apart from Iran itself, that the success of this deal is extremely important for the rest of the world. And you don't need to mention North Korea. We all know that. So all 28 member states of the European Union and the institutions are happy with the progress up to now. Where we have problems, of course, as everybody else does, not just Israel, but many other countries in the region, is, of course, what's happening in the region and Iran's role in some of the countries of the region. But that is a separate matter as far as we are concerned.
Okay.
The jewel in the crown, so far as Iran is concerned for the European Union, is this agreement and the fact that it is on track.
All right, Ali, let me give you a quick opportunity, because you were shaking your head in disagreement there. What did you want to say?
No, I mean, there are two issues. Firstly, I don't think that our colleague in Jerusalem is really reflecting also the wide spectrum of opinions within the Israeli security establishments. There are a lot of people in Israel that are quite happy with the Iran nuclear deal, because they do understand that Iran will not be able to develop a nuclear weapons, for the next time.
I haven't met them.
And I mean, there are a lot of different, takes on that.
But Robbie's point was that, well, it's only a limited period of time. And then after that, Iran is free to do what it wants, and that's a bad deal.
Well, I mean,
with nuclear weapons.
It's not a bad deal per se, but of course, there is no infinity in international agreements anyways. But for the foreseeable future, Iran will not be able to produce a nuclear weapon, and you also mentioned the IAEA's basically confirmation on that matter. Secondly, the problem is that you can criticize the Iran nuclear deal that it was not enough because it didn't address Iranian regional policies, which is a fair point. But the problem is that the Netanyahu government and also Israel has not much credibility on this issue, because they are themselves a nuclear power and outside of the NPT. So there should be some kind of arrangement beyond the Iran nuclear deal that should bring together the European and the American positions.
All right. And Robbie, I promised I'd come back to you. You wanted to complete a thought on an earlier point. Go ahead.
The earlier point was, speakers were talking about, well, let's apply pressure to Israel. This is not going to produce a deal, because the moment the Palestinians feel somebody else is going to apply pressure, EU, somebody, UN, and they don't have to sit and make compromises, this is preventing a deal.
No, Robbie, couldn't the exact same thing be said about the Israeli side now, with the American taking the position of giving recognition for Jerusalem being the capital to Israel? That creates less of an incentive for Israel to make any concessions.
I think it's worthwhile looking carefully at the US position. What they said is Jerusalem is Israel's capital. By the way, this has been realized by all states, including Arab states. As you know, the Egyptian ambassador, the Jordanian ambassador present their credentials to the president of Israel in Jerusalem. They make state visits in Jerusalem.
Sorry, Robbie, I do need to jump in that no Arab states have recognized Jerusalem as being the capital of Israel. And there is a slight difference, is there not? Because Israel is, I should say, the occupying power. That is Resolution 252, 476, UN Resolution 2334 says that Israel is an occupying power, particularly and specifically mentioning in East Jerusalem.
But I jump in here.
The only reference, sorry, if I can respond, is to East Jerusalem. No UN resolution in the last 80 years has referred to West Jerusalem. And how do you recognize the capital? When you make state visits there, when you present your credentials, when you sign treaties, all this has been done by all states, including the US and Russia and China and the Arab states. You're absolutely right. There is a dispute about East Jerusalem, but that is the only dispute. There's no dispute that West Jerusalem is the capital. And what Trump did here, very carefully, if I can just finish this, was to say, look, we recognize Jerusalem as the capital. He did not refer at all to borders, East Jerusalem. Obviously, here there is an issue in dispute, but there is no dispute that West Jerusalem is Israel's capital, and most states say we don't want to divide the city.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. All right, let's give James an opportunity to come in. Yes, please, go ahead on that one. No states dispute that Jerusalem is, or West Jerusalem at least, is the capital of Israel. That's an interesting thought, given that most countries have their embassies in Tel Aviv.
If I may say so, true. But I think we've got to avoid being disingenuous about this. The way in which that announcement from the American president was couched was to talk about Jerusalem as a whole. If there was a serious commitment to the two-state solution, we all know part of the two-state solution is indeed East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state. The failure to distinguish West from East in that announcement, I think, was very significant. And it was that, in fact, that I think has caused the greatest pushback from Europe and from all of the Arab countries and elsewhere all around the world.
Right.
Now, if there's real interest in a two-state solution and East Jerusalem as the capital, eventual capital of a Palestinian state, then why wasn't that distinction made up front when the announcement was made?
All right, we've gone back to the Jerusalem issue. I want to drag us back to the Iranian file, if we can again. And Ali, what do you make of suggestions that the Europeans may be counting on trying to convince Washington that the way to go forward on the Iran nuclear deal is to negotiate a separate deal when it comes to Iran's ballistic missiles? Do you think that's realistic, A, that the Europeans would be able to convince Washington of that, and can it be pulled off?
I mean, what we have experienced during the last years after the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal have been two tendencies. One tendency that is very apparent within the Trump administration is that there is an increasing demonization of Iran. Another tendency that is very much there across European capitals is a glorification of Iran, also especially when it comes to the Iran's regional behavior. The problem, and both demonization and glorification are not adequate to present us a realistic picture. So what we need to do is to bring those two positions together in order to save the Iran nuclear deal that might be collapsing after mid-January decertification by Trump and the reimposition of Iran sanctions. On the other hand, so a third way must be
Let me be
designed.
devil's advocate, and what Robbie or others or critics might say, it's also collapsing because Iran is vastly expanding its activities in the region and its missile program. Even though it's not part of the nuclear deal, that could be seen as provocative to the spirit of stability in the region, right?
That's what I'm saying in terms of the European glorification of Iran's regional policies that does not take into account those points and those points of concern. And so it has to be integrated in a wider Iran policy that is more sustainable,
right,
and that can bridge the gap that exists very much so between Brussels on one hand and Washington on the other. And it also, creates a lot of friction within the region, because there are a lot of Arab states that regard, Europe's behavior to be, not taking into account of those aspects of Iran's regional policies.
All right, we've just got a minute left. Let me go back to Robbie, and I asked you the question. I don't think we got round to getting an answer on it, Robbie. Ultimately, you said that Israel views this as a bad deal, but the question is, what does Israel want the European powers to do? It's clear Israel and what Israel wants from America. What does Israel want from the European powers? To agree to back out of it, to scrap it? Briefly, please, sir.
What they could do is to act against Iranian attempts to enter Lebanon. We've seen this. They're building military camps near the border. They're trying to get a corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean. And here Europe can help. France has influence in Lebanon. The Europeans have influence there. This can still be prevented. And if I had to look for an immediate request from the Europeans, it's not in anybody's interest, not in Israel's, not in the Arab states, not European, to see an Iranian military presence on the Mediterranean, and we're liable to see this very soon.
All right, we'll have to leave it there because I'm afraid we are out of time. Let's thank all of our guests here in the studio: Ali Fathollah-Nejad, Robbie Sable in Jerusalem, and James Moran in Cairo. Thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami, Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.